Welcome to The Whole Itself Remains. I am your host, Todd Caldecott, and you're listening to CJMP Co-op Radio 90.1 FM, broadcasting from the Cathet region on the beautiful Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, on the traditional territory of the Tla'amin people. And the show is also available on YouTube and your favorite podcasting platform. So in today's show, I'm going to be reviewing a recent study published in the journal Nature that examined the connection between visceral fat, or adiposity, and cognitive health, offering up some additional insight into how we can understand and even measure risk. And then I'll be interviewing North Carolina herbalist Dave Meesters, who I first learned of from his wonderful Substack published by him and his partner Janet Kent called Radical Vitalism. So I came across an article recently published in New Atlas entitled, "This Area of Fat is Aging Your Brain Faster Than Others." And I read the article and then I looked at the study upon which it was based. And I thought I would share the findings with you here because it was really interesting. So essentially what this study was doing was looking at the connection between visceral adiposity, or abdominal fat, the so-called love handles or spare tire that most people have as they move in the middle age, and its connection to accelerated brain aging and cardiometabolic risk. The study was published in the journal Nature Mental Health, entitled Regional Adiposity Shapes Brain and Cognition in Adults. It looked at how fat distribution, not total weight, is a good predictor, a better predictor than something like BMI, of both brain aging and cardiometabolic risk. And it explained why anthropometric measures such as the waist-to-hip ratio and other surrogate markers such as ApoB consistently outperform BMI and the so-called bad cholesterol reading, LDL-C, that most people get when they visit their doctor. So the study was based on a UK biobank cohort of some 18,000 adults aged 40 to 70. It used MRI mapping of adiposity as well as brain structural imaging and cognitive testing to identify which fat deposits correlate most strongly with brain structure and cognition issues. It was controlled for BMI, age, sex, education, and metabolic confounders. And it has some limitations. It was a population-level cross-sectional study. It wasn't a clinical trial. It's not causal, but it still provides some really interesting information that is corroborated by my own clinical experience as well as a lot of other research. So I think it's worth discussing. Now, the core findings of the study was that this visceral adipose tissue, or VAT for short, alters brain structure and function. If you have a higher degree of visceral fat, it leads to accelerated thinning of the cerebral cortex, disorganization of the white matter of the brain, and just overall promotes an older appearing brain. And these associations persist even after adjustments for BMI. The cognitive domains most affected by this include reasoning, memory, processing speed, and executive function. And there are a number of mechanisms that the paper looked at that linked this visceral fat and brain aging, including metabolic, vascular, and hormonal mechanisms. So one really important factor was inflammation. The presence of this visceral adiposity leads to the upregulation of cytokines such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. This activates the brain's resident immune cells called microglia that promotes neuroinflammation. Another mechanism is vascular injury. So chronic oxidative stress leads to endothelial dysfunction, and that causes damage to the small blood vessels in the brain. Also, this dynamic of insulin resistance. The brain is just resistant to the uptake of glucose, and that promotes neuronal energy starvation, and then eventually the accumulation of amyloid beta, the same detritus that we observe in patients that have Alzheimer's disease. And then finally, the issue of hormonal modulation. So it appears that women going through menopause, where there is a decline in estrogen, this can accelerate the visceral fat-linked neurodegeneration. So here it's really important to help maintain or support estrogen status. Maybe not going for HRT right away, but there are some fantastic things that we can use, such as phytoestrogens, both in the diet and supplementation form, as well as medicinal plants such as shatavari, dangui, pini, vitex, etc., that can all help to prevent that estrogen decline. Now, I thought it was really interesting that the paper looked at this issue of BMI, because BMI is a tool that is used to assess obesity that really just fails on so many counts. I haven't been using it for many years. Number one, it cannot distinguish between fat type and location. It's just a really simple mathematical measure. It is weight divided by the height squared. It is a measurement of size, not body composition. It cannot distinguish accurately between fat and muscle or where that fat is stored. So two people can have the same BMI but have very different metabolic risk profiles. In particular, the BMI misses those so-called toffee phenotypes, thin outside, fat inside. These folks might have a normal weight or even appear to be skinny, but they have a high degree of visceral fat, and that increases their cardiometabolic risk and this issue of accelerated brain aging. And this is commonly seen in folks of East and South Asian descent. So populations that have more visceral rather than subcutaneous fat, they might appear to be healthy according to the BMI, but they carry actually a much higher cardiometabolic risk. So I have been using instead the waist to hip ratio for many years. This is a very simple and powerful anthropometric measure of visceral adiposity. Quite simply, it is a measurement of the waist divided by the hip circumference and reflects visceral adiposity much more directly than the BMI. When I've looked at the research, it outperforms the BMI across the board. It is a much better predictor of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and dementia than the BMI. In fact, it is a much better predictor overall of all-cause mortality, and in some cases outperforms surrogate blood markers. Now, there are some standard cutoffs that I use for the waist to hip ratio. So in men, if your waist to hip ratio is 0.9 or less, this indicates low risk, whereas for women, it should be 0.8 or less. Now, there are some ethnic and genetic variations in the waist to hip ratio. Right? So the body shape and how genetics determine this can affect metabolic risk across these different populations. So for example, folks of East Asian descent, so these are Chinese, Japanese, Korean folks, they tend to have overall narrower hips, and this will raise the waist to hip ratio for a given level of fat. South Asian folks, people of Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi descent, they store proportionally more visceral fat and develop insulin resistance at an earlier stage in life. Folks of African ancestry, so it would be African Caribbean, Black American, they tend to store more fat in their hips, thighs, and buttocks, and this can lower the waist to hip ratio and mask the presence of central or liver fat. And so here we have to be careful because the waist to hip ratio might underestimate cardiometabolic risk in some individuals. But while patterns of fat storage can vary across populations, a waist to hip ratio of 0.8 in women and 0.9 in men generally indicates a higher cardiometabolic risk. Now, it's really interesting to contrast the waist to hip ratio, a simple measure that can be undertaken in just a matter of a couple minutes, versus a lipid panel, which is what you go in to get with your doctor a few times per year. And they express different dimensions of risk. The waist to hip ratio is a measure of structural risk. It shows where the fat is stored, whether it's visceral versus subcutaneous. And what this study shows us is that it's really important to discern this difference. In contrast, the lipid panel is a measure of the circulating risk. It shows how fats move throughout the body. But this can change dramatically over a period of a few weeks. Thus, when you go in and you get your lipid profile done, it's just a tiny snapshot of where your blood lipids are at that moment, and that can change. Whereas the waist to hip ratio, it doesn't change quickly and is a very good predictor of where your lipid profile will probably end up. So if I'm working with someone who has an elevated waist to hip ratio over a 3-month period, if we get that down below the cutoff, I can predict that their lipid profile is going to be dramatically improved. And the advantage of a waist to hip ratio is that some people present with a normal lipid profile, but if they've got this spare tire, this visceral adiposity, it still tells us they're at some degree of cardiometabolic risk. And if we look at the lipid ratio specifically, the triglycerides divided by the HDL-C, the good cholesterol, this is an estimation of insulin resistance, but it doesn't reveal fat distribution. So we have to balance this lipid panel with something like the waist to hip ratio. Even better, if we combine the waist to hip ratio with something like the ApoB, this will offer the most accurate picture of total metabolic and cardiovascular risk. I think it's also important to reassess the value of LDL-C, the so-called bad cholesterol. First off, we need to understand its limitations. When you get your bad cholesterol reading, the LDL-C, it's a measurement of the total cholesterol mass, but not the particle number or type. And so two people can have an identical LDL-C, but vastly different numbers and kinds of LDL particles. Broadly, there are two basic types of LDL particles. The large buoyant LDL particles, these are not atherogenic, and they're less likely to penetrate into the arterial wall, so for all intents and purposes, they are inert. And there's the small, dense LDL particles. These are definitely atherogenic. They infiltrate into the endothelium, they bind to endothelial proteoglycans, they oxidize rapidly, and they persist longer in the plasma. So if there is a high concentration of these small, dense LDL particles, this is a reflection of insulin resistance as well as hypertriglyceridemia and metabolic syndrome. So we pay attention to that one, not so much the large buoyant ones. And the discordance lies in the fact that someone can get a lipid panel done and their LDL-C might appear normal, and so everyone's fine and lulled into the state of complacency. But without doing the LDL-P test, we don't know what constitutes that reading. It could be that most of the LDL particles that they have are those small, dense ones. So while the reading appears to be normal, they are actually at increased cardiometabolic risk. And so not understanding the difference between large buoyant versus small dense and undertaking that extra step to look at what the bad cholesterol is actually telling us can underestimate the true atherogenic risk. It's also important to note that in older adults, an elevation of the bad cholesterol, LDL-C, does not consistently predict mortality, probably because the particle composition and systemic inflammation are stronger determinants of outcome. And in fact, older folks that have a low cholesterol reading, a low LDL-C reading, could actually be at greater risk of something like stroke. So I mention all this stuff because there is a better way to measure risk. So beyond LDL-C, let's look at what truly is of diagnostic value here, and that is primarily ApoB. So every harmful cholesterol-carrying particle, this could be VLDL, IDL, LDL, and lipoprotein A, has one ApoB molecule. So therefore, the level of ApoB equals the total number of atherogenic particles in your blood. And very often, LDL-C and ApoB don't match. And so if we're not going to do that additional LDL-P test, we need to make sure that we're paying attention primarily to the ApoB reading, because the LDL-C isn't going to give us much diagnostic value. And then, of course, we can look at the lipoprotein A. This is a genetically inherited LDL-like particle that can promote arterial calcification, clotting, and inflammation. The issue here is that the levels of lipoprotein A are set for life, and they're not changed by diet or lifestyle. So we will use this to identify inherited risk, and it helps to tailor prevention intensity rather than track a dietary or lifestyle response. Lastly, there is something called the coronary artery calcium score. This is a marker of advanced atherosclerotic disease, not early risk. And what it measures is the degree of calcification of plaques within the coronary arteries, and is particularly helpful for detecting late-stage mineralized lesions. So what you need to understand about a calcified atherosclerotic lesion is that this is an end-stage condition. It doesn't begin like that. Atherosclerosis takes many, many years to develop. Initially, it's just these fatty streaks that appear in the endothelium. Eventually, it becomes inflamed. And then the final stage is the deposition of calcium, causing the lesion to become hard and brittle, and little blebs can break off and form emboli, which then can cause stroke, etc. But that is a late stage condition. So when we're undertaking a coronary artery calcium score, this is to determine risk in a late stage condition. Now let's look at the basic score interpretation. If it's 0, then there's no calcification. But that doesn't mean that the person doesn't have atherosclerosis. It just means it's not calcified. If it's between 1 and 99, there's some mild calcification. Between 100 and 399, then there is a moderate burden of calcified plaque formation. And if it's over 400, well, it's pretty extensive. It's high risk calcification. So here, the coronary artery calcium score is a late marker of plaque stability and burden. It's useful for confirming disease progression, but not for early prevention. It's used primarily for middle-aged or older adults where those conventional markers like LDL-C, ApoB, waist-to-hip ratio might be a little bit ambiguous, or where we need some more detailed information. In future episodes, I'm going to look at ways in which you can reduce your cardiometabolic risk and to promote healthy brain aging. Next up is my interview with Dave Meesters. He's a herbalist living off-grid in the mountains of western North Carolina. He practices at the River Island Community Herb Clinic and teaches at the Terra Sylva School of Botanical Medicine. His approach to herbal medicine is inseparable from the broader work of planetary healing and human liberation. Together with his partner, Janet Kent, he explores these connections further in their newsletter, Radical Vitalism, and their podcast, The Book on Fire. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today on The Whole Itself Remains.
My pleasure.
So, Dave, I connected with you because I've been reading your Substack, and it's been amazing to me how resonant your thoughts and ideas are with my own on the subject of holism. We seem to be treading the same path, confronting the same kinds of questions and problems. And so I just find that so interesting. And something I've been leading off with in these interviews this season is asking folks, like, what is your working definition of holism?
Yeah, that is a really good question, right? Because I almost feel like it's easy for everyone to sort of have their own, or to be working with a sort of lack of a definition and just a vibe.
Yeah.
Um, but I think I was thinking about this some today. What do I mean by holism? And I think that the holism that I express most of the time, and the holism that I'm more comfortable verbalizing, is is a kind of what I think of sometimes as like a bottom-up form of
Hmm.
holism, which
Hmm.
is resonant with um, complexity theory
Hmm.
and systems thinking
Okay.
and the concept of emergent properties and
Mm.
the whole being more than the sum of its parts,
Hmm.
right? And this is a holism where it's not that the parts don't exist or that the parts don't matter,
Hmm.
but that the um, anything you're trying to learn or notice about a part, like the liver, the
Hmm.
heart, or something in the human body, to ground it in that, is always referred back to what it means for the whole,
Hmm.
what its place is in the whole, right? So there's like a constant attention
Mm.
to the higher level of context, to the greater whole. And um, and the a way of mapping the way how all the different moments and parts and phases and locations and functions and stuff within the body interrelate and cohere and bounce off of each other to form this like greater emergent property that is like a living human being, right? um, and then there's like another level of holistic understanding beyond that, which is that the human being is a whole, sure, but is continuous with
Mm.
the rest of the environment as well, right? Is
Mm.
continuous with the microbial life of the planet, through what we breathe in our skin and our eat, and is continuous with the human communities that we exist within and stuff. And so you can kind of scale the holistic perspective up,
Mhm.
um, as far as you want to go,
Right.
almost. And so there's like nested holes,
Okay.
and the parts only make sense in the context of the whole,
Right.
right? And so, I mean, I think that's where I feel at home,
Hmm.
most, especially like I said, the verbalizing part.
Hmm.
I feel like I have more words for that sense of holism,
Right.
versus what we might call a more like kind of top-down holism, which we can talk about too if you want, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, you and I are both we're both in the Western herbal tradition. I don't know you. I'm sure you have a background in other systems as well. Mine also in Ayurveda, some Chinese herbal
Yeah.
medicine. But we're both white Western dudes living in North America, and we live in this very reductionist culture, especially when it comes to medicine. So I'm always
Hmm.
curious to find out like why someone steps into this world of holism. Like, what is it about your personal experience that drew you to even ask these
Mm.
questions about what is holism, so was there some kind of crisis, was there some kind of like realization, some kind of
Mm.
intellectual exercise, or some combination of those different things that brought you to this subject?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that question itself could probably be answered a few different ways. Like part of it is just life journey, sociological, like who I was in contact with, the
Hmm.
milieus that I found myself moving within, and the influences that they had on me. Um, I also, hmm, I think that like, so putting aside just very briefly the question of holism
Hmm.
as a philosophy, I feel like I was drawn to herbal medicine. Um, for two reasons. One, because I loved plants and I
Okay.
thought they were amazing.
Hmm.
Two, because of the DIY aspect of it.
Ah.
Because of the aspect of you can grow medicine, you can make medicine in the kitchen, you can have medicine around in a
Hmm.
very like fairly accessible way. Even if you don't
Hmm.
have a garden, you can find stuff, right? And in a time period in my life when building autonomy from like not feeling trapped in and captured by the system and all of its tentacles,
Hmm.
including, the way that healthcare is like not just conceived, but like granted and withdrawn, and the barriers to care and all of those things that, feel very alienating in this world. The idea of uh, um, like participating in our own DIY medicine culture was very appealing to me. And the holistic aspect, I think, um, followed from that fairly naturally,
Hmm.
but also it it became clear to me quickly that I think that herbal medicine um, does its work best in a holistic framework
Hmm.
where there's multiple different interventions that are like synergistically, combining to cause a shift to create an effect. Um, pharmaceuticals can be formulated with a lot of power, like a lot of force to alter the terrain of the body
Hmm.
with just one pill.
Hmm.
Um, we have herbs that do that, but a lot of them work more gently. And then when sort of entered into a holistic system, like a complex system,
Hmm.
at a leverage point, now you can really start to move things. And it seemed to create more lasting change, more consequential change,
Hmm.
deeper, occasionally curative change to work
Hmm.
in this way.
Hmm.
So there's that just like methodological kind of procedural thing that unfolded as I started experimenting with herbs and learning herbal medicine. Like it's a good fit.
Hmm.
Um, but also, I mean, I would be remiss to leave out a sort of mystical aspect
Hmm.
um, that involved like the use of psychedelics and like all kinds of other experiences that made me appreciate in a nonverbal level like the deep interwovenness of creation and all of our lives and the interconnectedness of everything in a way that herbal medicine, as I was learning to use it, just seemed to flow and meet that perfectly.
Yeah, I think that's the case for a lot of folks in this field that I've talked to, especially men, is that their first kind of foray into the world of herbal medicine has been through, mind-altering substances, cannabis or other so-called plant medicines, which of course we know
Yeah, yeah,
is a term that narrowly defines particular effect on the body.
yeah.
But that seems to be, the gateway to a deeper level or deeper appreciation for just the impact that herbal medicine that plants can have on not just the consciousness but the body.
Yeah, 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 for sure. I mean, yes, sometimes it's really strong medicines that create undeniable effects,
Hmm.
can be the proof of concept, for the sort of diversity that you will come to appreciate later.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how many years have you been working with herbs in a formal way, or both formally and informally?
hmm Um, well, my early experimentations were in the context of just kind of like collective like punk houses that I inhabited in like the late 90s and around the turn of the millennium.
Okay.
And then shortly after that, I moved to the country, and then that was kind of the impetus once I mean, just immersed in plant life
Hmm.
and really into learning it. I did an apprenticeship with Corey Pineshane here
Okay.
in Asheville, and that was 2003. And so that was the beginning of my formal education.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
just gone on since then.
Nice. So you've been doing it for over 20 years then, at least
hmm
even formally. And I'm curious, like, what kinds of challenges have you had, understanding this principle of holism, that of understanding the interconnection of all things,
Yeah.
and then living, of course, in this Western reductionist culture. What kind of challenges have you faced in your practice, in your own life, in implementing these types of holistic paradigms?
Mm.
Like even just
Yeah,
like
it's a good question.
working with a patient that
hmm
they don't come from the same type of
Right.
epistemology. They have a different framework,
Yeah.
and you're existing within this society where you're interacting with doctors and pharmacists and you
hmm
disapproving
hmm
relatives. Like I don't want that on. So like I'm just curious, like just in any of those different aspects, sort of the challenges, like how do you circumvent those challenges? How do you move through them?
Yeah, let me think about that. Well,
Or like what challenges have you faced in that regard? Like
I
um
should start by saying that I um I think when I started in herbalism, I had a much more oppositional stance to biomedicine,
okay.
than I do now. And kind of like, you know, I might not have said this, but I think my like baseline assumption was that, oh, it was like, um, people being on pharmaceuticals, that was kind of like too bad, and it would be better if they weren't taking them, right? And that maybe I had a like underdog orientation about holistic medicine and herbalism that made me kind of like shake my fist at the paradigm
Hmm.
in a way. I've softened on a lot of that with
Hmm.
experience. And
Hmm.
nowadays, I find myself wishing that a lot of my clients had more access to biomedicine rather
Right.
than less.
Right.
Especially in the current situation here in the US, where a lot of that access is being withdrawn
Yeah.
and dismantled, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's a more recent development. Um, so, the fact that I'm coexisting with a reductionist paradigm
Hmm.
um, doesn't, I mean, occasionally in a client situation, maybe it will cause some friction, especially if a authoritative licensed practitioner like tries to talk my client out of taking the herbs or, you know, um, undermine my like recommendations in some way. So that happens sometimes,
Right.
but all of that's just a preface because I think that that stuff, it actually doesn't happen all that much.
Hmm.
And the biggest obstacle to implementing a holistic paradigm
Hmm.
that I can think of right now is that often I have like envisioned a plan, a plan of care that involves maybe like one or two herbal formulas and then other supportive changes for the
Hmm.
person to enact in their life, or practices to undertake, like maybe a breathing exercise that they do twice a day, maybe a small dietary change, or, just things. And that people have a really hard time taking on the whole plan and making it all happen.
Hmm.
That they're unsupported in making changes, that their life has very little wiggle room,
Hmm.
for them to try and fit new habits in.
Hmm.
And so they end up kind of defaulting to the easiest things to do, so that maybe they'll remember to take their herb tincture, but they uh, only find time to make the tea once or twice a week, or maybe not at all.
Hmm.
And some of the other recommendations like don't get followed through on, and it's not their fault. Um, it's not lack of willpower. I mean, I know that it's not that. It's like incompatibility sometimes, and so there's that flexibility that we need to have, the one that as a practitioner, where it's not just about convincing them and
Hmm.
like pitching the rightness or the necessity or the appropriateness of the plan or the justification, but also um, brainstorming around how to make a holistic plan of care accessible and fit into their life, and being flexible on my end,
Hmm.
so that they can get results, hopefully, at whatever level of uptake they're capable of right then.
Yeah, it's an interesting tension because obviously the way you and I work, I'm going to only assume based on what you're telling me that it involves a lot of personal responsibility, right? Like, you have to, have some level of discipline. And I'm reminded of in Ayurveda, there's criteria for like what is a good physician, but also what is the criteria for what is a good patient. And
Mm,
both of those have to be present in order for the treatment to be a success. Otherwise, it may be successful, but it might be more random if it does occur. So there
yeah.
are requirements. And so of a patient and a doctor, but of a patient to fulfill whatever recommendations. And so it can be a tricky thing to know where you draw that line. Obviously,
Hmm.
it's always the person's individual choice, and I'm not going to lose sleep over someone who chooses not to follow a protocol. But at the same time,
Yeah.
how do you, to what extent do you make concessions, or to what extent do you, hold the line and gently encourage? I remember a young practitioner asking me about this, and they were telling me about this case where the patient couldn't follow through with it, and so she was spending a lot of time like trying to reformulate her strategy, and I could see as it was happening that was also really undermining her confidence at the same time. And I
The
looked at
practitioner's
my
confidence.
sorry.
The practitioner's confidence?
Yeah, she was
Yeah.
losing her confidence, right? Because
Hmm.
the patient wasn't following through, wasn't getting better,
Yeah.
but it wasn't because they weren't the protocol wasn't sound. It was that the patient just wasn't doing it, and yet the patient kept coming back. And I you've countered this before,
Yeah.
and my colleagues in India and Nepal have a very different sort of strategy. I mean, they just like make the recommendation, and if the patient doesn't, they're like, well, that's it. It's like you have to do it or not do it. It's your
Hmm.
choice. I'm here to help you. And I feel like, they hold the physicians in a different regard.
Yeah.
Traditionally it was like they're like they're almost like a manifestation of some kind of deity, even though they know they're just a regular person, but they're coming through them as this divine knowledge, and so they're going to
Yeah.
respect it. And they're like, of course I'm going to listen to you. But here
Yeah.
I don't feel we necessarily have that same type of influence.
I don't know if I want that,
Okay.
I mean, I, yeah, sure. Everybody wants their um, knowledge or their skills to be respected,
Mm.
and um, and also, and the time that I put in to be honored and stuff. Like there is, I mean, I'm not going all the way to the other extreme where like I'm not looking for any respect, but at the same time, I don't know. I think that I don't know. I feel like constitutionally opposed to a hierarchical approach to being a practitioner. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, yeah, I get it. I think it was just more about like how do you balance the considerations of like, formulating a protocol that you believe is correct, and then working with the patient, and to whatever extent they're willing to follow it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and where your boundary is with like, well, I mean, maybe this isn't the right approach for you, or maybe I'm not the right practitioner for you.
Hmm.
To what extent do you stick to your guns, or do you, make concessions to, it's a
Yeah.
philosophical thing. Whatever we can do.
Right.
You can just eat one more carrot a day. I'm happy with that, right?
Yeah.
As
Oh,
opposed
yeah.
to, I've given you a list of things I would like you to complete, in order for you to get better. My experience is that when people follow through with my protocol, they get better. If they don't do everything,
Sure.
they're probably not going to get the same level of success. So my own
Hmm.
confidence dictates that, yeah, I really think they should follow through. I'm never going to force
Hmm.
anything on anyone, but yeah, just
Hmm.
how do you navigate that, especially within the sort of holistic paradigm?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that client practitioner relationship is it's like any relationship. It needs to be collaborative. You
Hmm.
know, both parties need to listen. Both
Hmm.
parties need to be flexible.
Hmm.
Both parties need to, be able to see the wisdom in what the other is saying.
Hmm.
And there's um, I'm like holding my fingers together like this because I'm trying to think of like, there's a permeability that needs to exist between the meeting of these two organisms, right? Um,
Hmm.
and uh, and so I would never want to be like, look, this is the present, like this is the package. Uh, Take it or don't take it, go to somebody else, right? Or like even imply anything like that, because there's a couple of things there. It's not just being constitutionally averse to the hierarchy. Okay, so there's that. But also, I don't usually think that there's one plan that's going to work and
Hmm.
only one,
Hmm.
right? And so the plan can evolve out of a two-way conversation. And if there are a lot of limitations that are on the client end, then it's true that perhaps only so much can be done,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and so you might have to admit to that person, like, well, with the limitations that we're kind of working with here, I can maybe help with your digestion in this one aspect,
Hmm.
but I can't necessarily provide a robust enough of, uh, of an influence, that
Hmm.
is necessarily going to address all these things that you're here for, right? I mean, just to hypothetically kind of speak to a possibility, so there is that stuff. And yeah, occasionally, I have somebody who I say, uh, it's just true that if you want to manage your Crohn's disease entirely using herbal and holistic things, then it is kind of like another job on top of your actual paying job,
Hmm.
and uh, and that's not for everybody.
No.
And no shame on not wanting or being able to take all that on.
Hmm.
And there are biomedical options, and you should consider them. And maybe you won't like them, and you can come back and we can talk some more and try
Hmm.
and iterate on this a little further. But everything's on the table.
Cool. Yeah, yeah, no, I really appreciate that perspective.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your wonderful essays on Substack. And
Mhm.
in one of your essays, you contrast genuine holism with what you call the wellness grift. And I'm just wondering, how do you personally define the line between an authentic holistic practice and then this modified version that we find on social media or in advertising?
Ah.
Just a little question.
Yeah. Um, well, so maybe I'll just put a little context onto this, which is just that, um, yeah, the essays that I've been writing are almost entirely provoked by the experience of what I watched happen after the arrival of COVID-19.
Hmm.
And this has been much discussed, and so I don't need to go into a whole lot of detail about it, but it was, the arrival of the novel coronavirus was seen. I mean, I don't know if this was a calculated thought, but it was at least an emergent process. It presented an opportunity for a lot of wellness brands and influencers, to jump in and take advantage of the like fear that people were experiencing and the desire for not just like robust protection and all the tools that they could get their hands on, but also taking advantage of a lot of people's innate skepticism of large institutions, public health, big, big pharma, all the things, right? And this presented an opportunity for them to jump in, and you know, we saw all kinds of things being promoted as the right way to think about COVID, or the better option. And as the pandemic progressed, I mean, people saying that like vitamin D is what's truly going to protect you from COVID. Um, just to name like one thing that I heard, um, was on the milder end of the BS that was being promoted, right? Because we heard everything from, the virus is here to upgrade your DNA to, I mean, whatever, all kinds of things. And I think that like a lot of what was put out there, part of the selling point, part of the pitch was that these are like more holistic approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And that even spreads far outside of COVID, right? Like you could say people are like, take turmeric instead of ibuprofen, right? It's the more holistic way to deal with joint pain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and but is it, And I think that that's where I've quibbled with like these people's claim that they're operating in the terrain of holism. Because I mean, if I was going to be generous, I could say that turmeric, whole turmeric, being a whole plant compound composed of dozens of phytochemicals all acting synergistically, you know, in the body, is, yes, more holistic just on that level
Mm-hmm.
than um, an over-the-counter pill like
Mm-hmm.
ibuprofen.
Or even just taking
But
curcumin or something.
yeah, or just taking curcumin, right? Which is just, one of, or the curcuminoids are a class of, it's like one type of chemical that's
Yeah.
found in the turmeric plant, right? But I think that the larger point is that like, uh, if you're making, if you're promoting a product and you're blasting it out, and your aim is to make sales, then the incentive is to sort of imply that it's good for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just don't think it works like that. The plants are being promoted out of context, out
Mm-hmm.
of context of a relationship with a practitioner, out of context of the uniqueness of your own body,
Mm-hmm.
out of context of any of those relational aspects that I feel like, for me have become crucial
Mm-hmm.
to actually do holism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a relational aspect, and there's the consultation. I mean, I know that not everybody has the luxury of having a consultation. I
Mm-hmm.
understand that, but there's, uh, you know, herbs are not drugs. They're not tested like that. They don't have um, that kind of they don't tend to have that kind of like reliability of like, oh, it's gonna do that thing. And uh, you're an herbalist too. Like part of what we do is we match herbs to the person.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to do with like the constitution of the person. That has to do with like what else we're gonna, there's so many things that show that you're taking the holistic context into account.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see missing when the aim is to make a sale.
Yeah, so sort of one size fits all approach or paint by
Yeah.
numbers. Lot of practitioners, and I don't mean to cast any shade on other professions, but because I've taught at naturopathic university, some naturopaths that come out of that training end up practicing in a decidedly non-holistic fashion, but they have various different techniques of assessment that really remove their own kind of intuitive ability to understand what the connections are between remedy and patient, and so use these kind of paint by numbers approaches. Oh, the machine is, here's the receipt of paper. Okay, well, this is what we need to do.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
that to me that also speaks to a little bit of this wellness grift because it removes accessing the practitioner and the patient sort of innate intelligence. Like I do believe that we have hardwired into us there's the innate healing potential. It's just a matter of us removing the obstacles to discover what that is.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, right. How does the how do you feel like the holistic approach connects with the innate healing potential?
I think we speak it from a vitalist perspective that
Yes.
the body is oriented towards restoring homeostasis. And when
Yeah.
it encounters an obstruction, then, it may induce inflammation or some kind of
Yeah.
enhancement of excretory function, which itself is uncomfortable and symptomatic, like a fever. Like nobody wants a fever, nobody wants diarrhea. But,
Mm-hmm.
the way I imagine you and I view that
Mm-hmm.
is that we want to support the resolution of that natural homeostatic imbalance to a state of rebalancing, and
Yeah.
that is what the body wants, that is what the body is oriented towards, and it's a matter of us finding out like what is the right recipe to remove those obstructions so that that innate healing potential can flow.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And for better or for worse, I feel like that process doesn't scale very well
Yeah, I
in
would
the
agree.
marketplace.
I would agree. I would agree.
And hence the incentive to streamline, to algorithmize the process, to take blood work and feed it into a machine and spit out a
Yeah,
list of supplements,
yeah.
to market one size fits all things. What we do, it's like the incompatibility with that part of the marketplace is, I think, beautiful, but it also, but it also generates a friction that certain people are going to try and overcome that friction by shaving off aspects of the holistic philosophy until there's basically nothing left, you know?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would agree. I want to just go back on a point because just to clarify things, I don't know if you believe this, but you thought, or you maybe described that vitamin D supplementation was a form of BS. I mean, I understand it's not going to prevent infection, but did you find that it was helpful in at least preventing morbidity and possibly mortality? And or do you have any complaint with that thesis?
Um, I I mean, I'm a big advocate of vitamin D. I teach a whole class on it at our
Okay, okay.
school, and uh, and I think that vitamin D from the sun is more valuable than vitamin D from a pill, but also vitamin D from a pill is something that I also recommend sometimes.
Hmm.
And I don't have a lot of skepticism about the benefits or like about the fact that vitamin D is important and has benefits. What I thought was BS was the overblown claim that uh, this is what's really gonna prevent you from getting COVID, right?
Hmm.
It's that turning up the promise, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it was made more or less right off the bat in the absence of data, you know? And so that stuff, I call BS on that because, it's like it's one thing to extrapolate from past experience and hypothesize that since we know vitamin D status has some bearing on influenza transmission and the severity of influenza infection, and whether you're going to get infected when you're exposed, because it does have all those things, that it would have that same relationship to COVID-19. Um, the data on that, now that we're kind of looking back on it, seems kind of mixed, but we don't have to go into that. But my point is that people were touting vitamin D way out ahead of really knowing anything
Hmm.
about it. And they were promising. I mean, that's the thing, and this is like, ties into something that I'm going to be trying to address in the next installment of my series is like, uh, is do we promise too much?
Right.
Are we too confident? And by we, maybe I don't mean you and me, but I mean kind of, I think that the wellness world online was definitely guilty of promising too much,
Yeah.
promising too much, uh, getting way out ahead of the knowledge, like taking a shred of speculative potential and blowing it up into, a sure to be game-changing promise. Um, and that happens all the time.
Mhm.
And, but then um, to take that observation in a really exaggerated form, and then to sort of to bring it home and be like, what are the fair claims and promises that we can make about the kinds of healing that are available in the kinds of work that we do is
Mhm.
something that I'm about to work on trying to talk about. But that's not
Nice.
quite to your question, but it
No, no, but I,
relates to the vitamin D thing, kind of. Yeah.
yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that. So you also write that illness is systemic and that capitalism itself generates disease. And then I'm just wondering how, like in your own work, how do you connect individual care, like within a clinical practice, within a broader political or ecological action? Like, is there some connection there for you?
Uh, like a like an actual connection of my herbal clinical practice
Yeah,
to
well, I mean,
broader.
when you're, I mean, you working with patients, you see
Yeah.
the systemic problems, and in your own
Mm.
work, you connect to this broader issue of capitalism.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how that awareness kind of informs your practice and how it's connected to sort of broader political or ecological themes. Like, what are the
Yeah.
implications of that? Like that you're dealing with this systemic, late stage capitalism
Yeah.
and all
Yeah.
the problems associated with that. And so you're practicing on an individual basis, helping people, but how does that broadly connect to this other ethos of just looking at how we're operating within society, within this political world, especially in the U.S. that we find ourselves in,
Yeah.
and what it means for the future of society and our ecology.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. And it is one of like the harder, um, honestly, it's one of the harder things to weave it together and to make properly holistic, I think, in my practice, because by the nature of the clinical relationship, we're working with the person in front of us,
Mhm.
right? And there might be things that they can change about the conditions of their life. They might be able to change their job,
Mhm.
you know, move, sleep in a different room in their house. They might be able to change a relationship in their life that's causing them trouble. There are some modifiable things that aren't just like taking herbs and stuff.
Mhm.
But we can't, for our clients, uh, grant them housing security as part of our plan of care. You know, um, I wish I could do that. I mean, I can connect them with services sometimes, and that's
Right.
definitely, I mean, part of my referral network includes like, oh, this is where you can go for healthcare, for counseling, for, housing assistance, for all of these things. And so that's like a way of helping them navigate the messed upness of the world. But in the clinical relationship, we don't have like a very big lever on the whole like ecological political reality there. But that analysis is very important to me. And
Mhm.
it's definitely, I see it in almost every single client I see. I
Mhm.
see how the messed up out of balance-ness of the world, the predatory relationships that consist in capitalism, are making people sick, are
Mhm.
jacking up stress levels, are have an effect on the food that's available to them, and all of these things are things that I observe. And, there might be some wiggle room for a person about navigating that a little bit more healthily or less or something. But I think as far as um, the world making us sick, it's working in a lot of ways outside the clinic that is going to change that. I bring it into my teaching.
Hmm.
Um, I feel like a lot of my students resonate with that framing,
Hmm.
and want to participate in holistic healing at every scale, including being an activist, being an advocate, and being a clinician, and finding a way to do all these things. I mean, I think I would love to participate in collectives that make holistic care more accessible.
Hmm.
I would love, I scrawled notes on an essay that maybe I'll write one day called Dining Halls Now, and which is like a call for to normalize communal eating structures, which is totally utopian, but it's still like a huge barrier. The fact that like everybody is expected to cook for themselves or maybe just a couple other people on top of themselves is a ridiculous burden.
Yeah.
I mean, is a ridiculous burden. It takes so much time, executive function. It takes so much. I mean, some people love to cook. That's great, but it's like it's distributed across the society, and you know the importance of food as much as I do when it comes to health. But like, for people who already, you know, um, it's so hard for them to keep up with cooking for themselves at all. I want people to have dining halls to go to. I want people to be able to walk down the block and go to a dining hall and for that not to cost money, right? Because we have restaurants already, but for that, I mean, so that's my utopian thing. But I don't know, a lot of my uh, ideas about how we could make our built environment and the world around us not negatively impact our health as much
Hmm.
uh, are like that. They're like ideas that are either kind of utopian or take a lot of organizing muscle and are not going to be realized on a short timeline.
But they address an existential reality. In my 2011 book, Food is Medicine, I wrote an epilogue, and I've written this book about the importance of food and how to obtain it and prepare it and all the different issues related to nutrition. But in the end, what I realized was that eating itself is an act of communion. You're communing with nature, and the fundamental problem that I saw even back then was this emergent problem of loneliness. Of course, this is a perennial human issue, but it's certainly become greatly exacerbated. And it
Yeah.
seems to be that in a society where we're just focused on our own kind of narrow interest, that we lose the opportunity to nourish ourselves through nourishing others, and
Yeah.
that addressing that fundamental issue of companionship, of loneliness, is really how we get to this next level of health and healing.
Oh, heck yeah. No, I love that. And I agree with it completely. And what better thing to gather around than food
Yeah.
and meals? Um, that's not going to be for everybody, but there's room for people to opt out of that as well in my utopian scheme. Um, but, part of me thinking about that is like, I think that um, I realized that for a lot of people, some of our best memories and times of life happened to coexist with times when meals were kind of being prepared for us, like maybe summer camp or going to college and going to the dining hall at the college campus, or
Mhm.
all of this stuff. And when I used to live in punk houses, part of the beauty of that was, there'd be like 10 people who like lived in a house, and we would take turns making dinner. And you
Mhm.
would make dinner like 1 or 2 nights a week, and the other nights, someone else, you would know that there would be dinner when you
Mhm.
came home at a certain time. And
Right.
just all of that, the companionship that you're talking about, and the offloading of the need to always be thinking about the next meal and what's
Mhm.
it going to be and what's it going to be composed of and do I have everything? um, those two things, if we could shift those, I think we'd be in a lot better place just right there.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's such a foundational aspect of our experience is the function of nutrition and sharing that abundance with each other. would get to
Yeah.
the root of a lot of our problems. And I think it innately connects us to this holistic paradigm,
Yeah.
where we're none of us are separate, where we're all connected.
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful.
Dave, I'm gonna have to wind things up for today. Thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with me. I really appreciate you giving me your time.
Sure. Man, we barely scratched the
I
surface.
know. Well, that means that we've got more time in the future. I look forward to connecting, and I'd love to have you back on sometime.
I'd be happy to do it. Well, thanks for inviting me on. This was, yeah, this was a great conversation, and thanks for, I don't know, hearing me out about all these topics that obviously I'm pretty opinionated about.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dave.